Thank you, Michael, for that introduction. And yes, I've been here for a few days, and it'll be difficult leaving in the middle of what seems to be an exciting time for Cyprus's civil society movement. Hopefully, I'll have occasion to come back. Good evening, and thank you very much for being here. A lot of things that I'm going to say have actually been said by the people who matter in Cyprus tonight, including the broadcast authority, the municipality, CCMC. These are the kinds of things that you would want to hear if you're going to create a community media platform here in Cyprus. Thank you very much to all of you for the warm welcome and for inviting me to take part in this, what seems to be an exciting moment in the history of civil society action and its role in social change in Cyprus. My thanks especially to CCMC, which is doing some amazing work here, leveraging community media for peace building and reconciliation among communities. The more I hear about the situation here, the more I am convinced of the relevance of community media to your present as well as to your future. It gives me great pleasure to bring to all of you enthusiastic greetings from the community media movement in India, of which I am a part, as Michael already mentioned. Community media today globally represent a vibrant, countervailing force to mainstream media that are owned and controlled by corporate conglomerates and private business houses. In many parts of South and Southeast Asia, the region that I come from, Latin America, Africa, Australia, North America, Northern and Western Europe, ordinary people in remote rural villages as well as in deprived metropolitan spaces are seeking to gain access to media technologies to tell their own stories through their own eyes and in their own words. The issue here is about addressing what a friend of mine, scholar Joe Tachi, and others have called voice poverty. We're not talking about financial poverty, but voice poverty. The increasing marginalization of people's voices in governance and public policy making in key areas, especially in key areas concerning the lives and livelihoods of people, especially people who feel disenfranchised and subordinated by a hegemonic political and social system. The issue here is also about addressing the real democratic deficit. And I'm not using that term in the sense in which it has been used in some EU debates, but I'm talking about democratic deficit in terms of, when institutions of democracy have fallen short of fulfilling the needs and aspirations of citizens, reducing them only to voters whose consent to be ruled is ritually sought during elections held periodically, once in 4 years, once in 5 years, whatever is the case. The issue is also about the nature of the public sphere that democratic countries want to constitute and sustain, reflecting the diversity and plurality of many of our societies. This issue of the public sphere is something that I will return to at the end of the talk. UNESCO, as has been pointed out already by the UNESCO representative here, has long recognized the importance of media for social change in an unequal world. The Irish diplomat Sean McBride's Many Voices, One World, the 1976 report on the state of the global communication scenario, which was commissioned by UNESCO, is one of the earliest analyses of international communication imbalances and the distorted images that this unequal system produced. While this early intervention was very much within the realm of the nation state as a unit of analysis, because McBride primarily looked at countries and imbalances between countries. The growth and rise of civil society movements through the 1980s and 1990s have contributed to the shaping of UNESCO's focus on Community Media as part of its wider emphasis on promoting media pluralism, diversity of content, and the right to cultural self-expression, all issues that matter a great deal on this island. UNESCO has been working with national campaign groups and grassroots organizations in different parts of the world to advocate the creation of an enabling policy environment for community media, support attempts to set up community-owned and managed media projects such as community radio, and also encourage cross-fertilization of ideas and learning from the field through capacity building and knowledge dissemination. It is in this context that the UNESCO Chair on Community Media, if I may say a few words about the chair, the first of its kind anywhere in the world, was established earlier this year at University of Hyderabad, India, where I work, to serve as a knowledge and resource center on various aspects of community media. The chair's mandate includes research and documentation of good community media practices around the world, especially in the South Asian region, and provide inputs to stakeholders on issues such as community participation, community mobilization, financial and social sustainability of community media, appropriate content, and participatory monitoring and evaluation of community media projects. We offer open access information related to licensing, policy, technology options to community-based organizations. The chair seeks to build capacities of community members to not only operate various media, but also to mobilize communities, develop relevant programming, and manage community media outlets in a participatory manner. Of course, constant engagement with policymakers and practitioners to sustain a democratic and citizen-friendly community media landscape in India and elsewhere continues to be central to the UNESCO Chair's activities. I am glad to report to this gathering that after years of intense policy engagement with the government, along with grassroots experiments in community media production, the airwaves were opened to community radio in India, somewhat hesitantly in 2003, with a more full-fledged policy permitting civil society organizations to set up and run radio stations announced 4 years later in 2007. So we have a full-fledged policy now that permits educational institutions as well as civil society organizations to apply for licenses under this policy. We now have about 140 radio stations licensed under this policy. And given the size of the country, this is barely adequate. I mean, we are looking at something like 3,000 to 4,000 community radio stations across the country. Yeah. Now, these radio stations, the 140 stations licensed, broadcast in an incredible range of languages. Even for India's famed linguistic diversity, the languages in which they are broadcasting is really incredible. I mean, it includes Bundeli, Haryanvi, Bhojpuri, Kutchi, Telangana, Telugu, linguistic communities which are beyond the pale of official recognition. Those of you who've been to India or know about India would have probably heard of Hindi, Tamil, or the dominant languages, but I'm not even talking about this. These are small linguistic communities, right, which are broadcasting over these radio stations. In India's neighborhood, like Nepal, completely disproportionate to its small size, boasts of about 200 community radio stations, even without a formal policy, formal community radio policy. And despite its troubled history of violent conflict and authoritarian rule, so that hasn't stopped them from having community radio stations. Continuing with South Asia, Bangladesh's recent bid to democratize the media landscape has already spawned over a dozen community radio stations, barely in the last 2 years. South and Latin America, with a checkered history of radical social and political movements, always had a lead over other regions of the world in community media. Colombia, for instance, in spite of endemic violence of all kinds, has over 1,000 community radio stations. many striving for peace through community-based action. Community radio in Africa, according to a 11-nation survey, registered an astounding rate of 1,386%, just the rate of growth, between 2000 and 2006. The Democratic Republic of Congo, one of the more populous countries on the African continent, alone has about 250 community radio stations. The CCMC and other friends involved in the community media movement here in Nicosia probably know about the state of the sector in Europe much better than I do. I was reading in preparation for this visit the state of community media in the European Union report of 2007, which suggested that there was a higher level of community media activity in northwestern Europe, while more modest levels of activity were reported from many of the new member states. The report showed no data for Cyprus. And this was also the case with the survey of community broadcasting in Europe done by Steve Buckley a few years later. I hope from what we heard tonight and during this morning's meeting, I'm sure this will change very soon. I'm also told that last year for a similar survey, the Cyprus Regulatory Authority reported those 3 stations that the director mentioned, which are under the label of community radio, counting the 3 licenses given to educational institutions, including the University of Cyprus. Now, among other things, the EU report that I mentioned had called for a more enabling legislative framework in Europe, the development of sustainable models of community radio, and increased networking and knowledge sharing among community media organizations in the member states. The excellent report on the role of community media in promoting social cohesion in Europe, prepared in 2008 for the Council of Europe by Peter Lewis, who I understand was here last year for the Community Media Forum Europe conference, made similar recommendations, with the added observation that community media contribute to social cohesion and citizenship, especially for minority, ethnic, refugee, and migrant communities. Earlier this year, at a meeting in Brussels, AMARC Europe, AMARC is the short form for the World Association of Community Radio Broadcasters, took cognizance of the fact that community media contribute to media pluralism and help strengthen cultural and linguistic diversity, social inclusion, and local identity. It called upon EU and its member states to not only create appropriate regulatory conditions, but also provide public financial support to the community media sector in their respective countries. Even as many European governments have now caught the community media bug, as is evidenced in exciting different developments in different parts of the continent, much remains to be done. This is not perhaps the time to go into the various policy frameworks and the values and principles that drive them. However, if creating a strong policy support requires active and constant engagement in many cases with central and federal authorities, community media, by virtue of its emphasis on the local information and events, local governance, local language and other identities, local culture, etc., always will have a symbiotic relationship with local governments. With community media, defined usually as the third sector, outside of the state and market, the relationship, actual relationship or potential relationship between citizen-controlled community media and the government is quite complex and fraught with anxieties about the autonomy of the community media sector. As I already mentioned, the state, uniquely endowed with regulatory powers, certainly has a role to play in expanding democratic spaces for citizen participation in governance. In the case of community media, this would involve creating a liberal licensing regime, and we have heard a lot of positive things tonight about that here in Cyprus, and committing public resources to initiate and prop up various community media initiatives by civil society organizations. Such pro-sector measures, if any, would have to be channeled through appropriate institutional frameworks that are relatively autonomous of the particular government in power. For example, through an independent regulator or an autonomous funding body, to allay genuine fears that the NGO sector would have about co-optation. The relationship between community media and local power structures, however, is bound to be qualitatively different. And I'm talking about municipal authorities and other local authorities. Given that community media embody the spirit of participatory democracy that emphasizes more active involvement of citizens in democratic governance. Interestingly, just this morning I picked up a European document titled Active Citizenship, which is an EU document, exactly what I'm talking about. The geographical proximity and immediacy of local authorities to media that are by definition platforms for articulating concerns of local communities and for expressing local identities makes this relationship a crucial element in the long-term sustainability of community media. To quote a pioneer of bush radio in South Africa, community radio is 90% community and 10% radio. And that community is local community. Citizens' participation in media production encourages the development of a democratic civic attitude that in turn promotes a civic culture at the macro level. The principles of dialogue, deliberation, and consensus-oriented decision-making that are embedded in community media should serve local governments well. The challenge for community media organizations is to negotiate a link to local governments that is cooperative yet independent, retaining the critical edge that lends credibility to their activities. To borrow from an African study of the sustainability of community radio, it is necessary to distinguish between promoting local government and promoting local governance. And community media has a strong stake in the latter, promoting local governance. From the point of view of local governments, offering support to community media work as a valuable public service while resisting temptations to assimilate or co-opt would earn them greater legitimacy in public perception. This is in contrast to, say, in some other countries, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where, according to one study, a third of the radio and television stations there are either directly owned or funded by municipal governments, which in some ways delegitimizes them as genuine citizens' media outlets. As has been pointed out by other communication scholars, local governments have become important communicators in local communities because of a variety of factors, including the increasing demand that municipal administrations become more transparent and become more accountable to citizens, and the institutionalization of public relations as an important aspect of local government. In many countries, community media act as tools of public auditing of local government programs and local government projects, and thereby making it possible to have a more responsive government. In Nepal, community radio has proved to be a valuable tool in popularizing social accountability processes, such as public hearings and citizen report cards through radio jingles, through radio reports, live broadcasts of public hearings of village and district development committees, which are the local government equivalent in Nepal. In some of the remote villages of eastern India, where we have done research, people have told us how the block development officer now visits their village more often, thanks to the local radio broadcast regularly highlighting their problems, such as lack of safe drinking water or difficult access to primary health care. In the northern Indian state of Haryana, the local police authorities come on Radio Mewat, a small community radio station, to address citizens' concerns related to traffic control and crime. In July this year, the station actually announced a phone number that people could call to register their complaints with the police, thus overcoming the people's reluctance to go to a police station and to register a complaint. And a senior police official comes to the station every week to respond to these complaints on air. Yeah. Now, these are some examples of how active citizen alertness could lead to a more responsive local government. Space and infrastructure can often be a major hurdle for setting up community media outlets. Local governments could offer accommodation in public buildings, either rent-free or at nominal rents, or through waiving of local taxes. And this has been done in many parts of the world. Similarly, it has been suggested that certain public utilities, such as electricity and water, be offered at concessional rates to community media outlets because it is primarily a public service. Municipalities could make budgetary provision for funding production of public service-oriented programs on community media and have transparent and non-partisan processes to assign these funds. This funding could extend to supporting capacity building of volunteers as the stations attempt to widen the circle of technically competent citizens, and perhaps also for upgrading infrastructure and to do audience research. In the Netherlands, the main provision for public funding is through local governments, who are entitled to levy households a local charge through public service, local charge to support the community broadcasting service. I know it hasn't been used very often in the Netherlands, although there is that provision in the legislature allowing local governments to levy a charge on households and use that money to fund local media. If the policy or legislative framework allows for advertising, and in many parts of the world it allows for some advertising, which can be for local products, local services, not for multinational products and things of that nature. If the policy framework allows for advertising, some support to community media outlets could be extended through public service advertising by local governments. In India, for instance, the Directorate of Audiovisual Publicity of the Government of India empanels community radio stations for receiving government advertisements, publicizing its developmental and social welfare schemes. Yeah, so some money. These are at nominal rates and make some modest contribution to the financial sustainability of community radio stations. However, the importance of avoiding over-reliance on any single source of funding cannot be overstated. Right? It's important to avoid over-reliance on one single source. Vesta Radio, an NGO-owned station in Tuzla, Bosnia and Herzegovina, sees itself as a partner to the local government. Again, another interesting model, promoting local development. On the one hand, they perform a watchdog role by bringing public pressure to bear on the local government on specific issues, but on the other, they work with the local government to apply for projects together. For instance, a typical project on training agricultural entrepreneurs in the community finds a resonance with the local government in Tuzla, while Vesta Radio does public affairs broadcasting on the same subject. Right? So that's a kind of a symbiotic relationship. So there are many exciting possibilities for a dynamic community media sector to work closely with committed local authorities to promote greater citizen participation in governance. Let me now return to the question of the public sphere that I mentioned in the beginning. What kind of a public sphere do we want to conceptualize? And what roles are the state and civil society called upon to play in this public sphere? Critical theorist Nancy Fraser, and I forgive your indulgence to listen to a little bit of academic talk, but I hope it makes sense. Critical theorist Nancy Fraser, after critiquing Habermas's idea of the bourgeois public sphere as monolithic and exclusionary, makes the now famous case that in both stratified societies, meaning unequal societies, as well as in more egalitarian, multicultural societies such as Cyprus, participatory parity can be approximated only through a plurality of competing publics rather than a single comprehensive public sphere. Right? It's always better to have multiple publics. She then goes on to challenge the assumption that a functioning democratic public sphere requires a sharp separation of state and civil society. And that's the assumption a lot of people make, that civil society is necessarily oppositional in nature. And she challenges that. Understanding civil society as the realm of non-governmental associations, Nancy Fraser argues that this domain of discourse of private citizens results in generating critical public opinion, but does not necessarily produce any binding sovereign decisions which is only in the realm of state power to be able to implement the kind of decisions that public opinion generates, you require the state. Without the latter, civil society would at best represent what she calls weak publics. Sovereign state authority with the power to enforce decision making would then represent for her the strong publics, with some structure of accountability to the weak publics, right? Like I said, being accountable to citizens. We can of course contest this argument, as some scholars have done. However, the incontestable fact is that civil society action need not necessarily be seen as inherently antagonistic or oppositional to the state. Community media could be romanticized as alternative media, countering media controlled and managed by the state on the one hand, and also as alternative to market-controlled media. But in reality, they exist in a much more nuanced relationship to the state, especially with local governments, with whom they could be in partnership for strengthening democratic governance and citizen participation. It is unlikely that either community media would be able to offer relevant community-centric programming, or local governments would be able to offer credible, transparent, and accountable governance without developing a more symbiotic relationship with each other, between local governments and community media. Needless to say, this becomes possible only under conditions that secure institutional safeguards for the autonomy of the community media sector. And as has been mentioned, my meetings this morning with the Broadcast Authority and the words that we heard tonight, there is a lot of hope of something like this coming about on this island, with an autonomous community media sector emerging perhaps as a third tier of broadcasting here, like it is in many other democratic countries. I mean, you already have a thriving public broadcasting sector, a commercial sector, and hopefully soon a community media sector of broadcasting. Thank you once again for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to share some of my thoughts with you all, and if time permits and the chair permits, I'm willing to take a few questions. Thank you very much.